My name's Kim Clarke. I'm subject leader for religious studies at the Grange School and I'm an SLE through the Astro Alliance. I thought I'd spend a little bit of time just talking about how we've developed remote learning in RS since the lockdown. So today what I'd like to talk about is how we've adapted the curriculum for remote learning and to share some techniques for differentiation and challenge via remote learning. So if I cast my mind back to the early days of March where we first started thinking about the possibility of lockdown and remote learning, it soon became pretty clear what our challenges were. Firstly, for our Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 classes, we were about to come on to some very tricky concepts. Key Stage 4, we were halfway through the Islam paper. So we had to cover concepts such as jihad, the 10 obligatory acts, the festivals of Eid and Ashura. So lots of key specialist terminology that students need to know and lots of sources of wisdom and authority that they need to know. For Key Stage 5, I teach the philosophy paper and we were just about to come on to religious language, which is a difficult topic at the best of time to teach, let alone remotely. My colleague who teaches the ethics side of the paper was about to come on to business ethics. So again, a topic that does very well under debate and discussion, but remotely could definitely be a challenge to teach. We also had to think about how to promote engagement in Key Stage 3, particularly for those students who have not yet developed their independent learning skills that they'll go on to develop in Key Stage 4 and 5. We also had to think about Year 9, those that aren't taking RS to GCSE, how are we going to keep them engaged, even though we all knew that realistically they probably weren't going to prioritise RS, if do any RS at all. So we had to think about interesting ways of promoting the subject and keeping them interested. We had to also think about differentiation. This is in terms of the accessibility of our work to students. Teaching in a secondary modern setting, we have a massive range of abilities, so we needed to make sure that the very top was stretched and those that needed a bit of extra support had that as well. We also had to think about the accessibility of resources. I think it's very easy to assume that everyone has similar sort of remote access capabilities. However, we had to assume that not everyone may have access to a laptop, or if they did, it might be shared. We had to think about students who might not have a quiet place to work at home, or students who would be accessing work off their mobile phones. Particularly for those students that live in a more rural setting, we had to consider the fact that their Wi-Fi might not be so good and that they might be relying on their 4G network, in which case we didn't want to give them lots of things to download and use up all of their 4G capability. We also had to think about our own well-being and how we were going to manage our teacher workload. We were all approaching this period of unknown with a sense of trepidation. We were very nervous about it. So we had to think about how we could ensure that we did the best by our kids, but we also looked after ourselves. So this was quite a challenging time. So we started thinking about RS and our curriculum design as a process. We thought, what did we want the students to get out of their weekly learning? How are we going to deliver this? And how are we going to assess understanding? And this informed what we did. As a school, for the first 2 weeks of lockdown at the end of the Easter term, our policy was to put work on Show My Homework initially. This work focused on revising and consolidating the topics that students had already learned. This gave us time to consider our options and look into various other ways of delivering the curriculum to students and exploring different ways of working remotely. So these 2 weeks gave us plenty of time to think about how we were going to improve our offer in RS and how we were going to deliver this remote curriculum. For those of you that have been teaching for a few years, you'll probably be familiar with the Nando's menu of work. The first time I came across this was about 8 years ago and it absolutely blew my mind. I'd never seen menu style homeworks before and I absolutely loved it. Like most things in teachings, however, It was a passing trend, and certainly for the last few years I'd barely given it a second thought. However, I'd spent some time talking with a friend who has some children of primary school age, and they were given a Nando's menu type piece for their lockdown work. They were given a different piece every week, and their children were asked to choose their own curriculum. And I thought this was a really good idea. Certainly talking to this friend, he was all for it because it allowed his children to take ownership of their work, and it allowed them to fit their work around the challenges, particularly of those first few weeks of lockdown where we were all getting used to this alien situation. So therefore, we decided we would adopt this Nando's menu to religious studies. In order to allow the students to actually access the tasks off the Nando's menu though, they needed to know the subject content. Now this allowed us to produce some differentiated reading resources. So for Key Stage 3 and 4, we produced easy, middle and hard readings. So therefore we had two levels of differentiation going on. We had differentiated reading and we also had differentiated tasks. Now we would ask students each week to submit their different tasks, and that would be how we assessed their learning. So here's our adaptation of the Nando's menu that we use for Year 8. And we have this for Year 7, 8, 9 and 10. As you see, the extra hot tasks are those which are quite demanding, those which require students to use their creativity or to transform the information into another type. The hot allows students to extend their own learning, and particularly one of my favourites is transforming it into a poem that summarises it. I read a piece from one of my Year 8 students the other day about the life of Guru Nanak, and it was absolutely joyful. He put it into blank verse. The mild allows students to reduce the information down, such as into a summary that would fit on a postcard, in a crossword or in a CV. Now we decided to use a CV rather than a Facebook page because we were conscious that we didn't necessarily want to promote using more screen time. For the lemon and herb, this is for those students that might require a little bit extra support. The tasks are fairly straightforward, such as a diary entry, creating a glossary, and summarising and reducing the topic down to flashcards. So therefore, each week the students take the easy, middle or hard reading, they read it, and they do one of the tasks. For Key Stage 5, our initial plans were to do simple reading from the textbook, and then to expect them to email evidence of their notes or essay plans in. After a few weeks of working in this fashion, it allowed us an opportunity to reflect and consider our successes and areas for development. We'd asked students for their feedback. In terms of successes, it was felt that the flexibility of tasks was a real strength because it allowed students of all abilities to choose something that suited them. It also kept things fairly fresh because one week they could be writing a CV, the other week they could be doing a diary entry, the week after that they could be doing some evaluation work. For those students with different learning styles, those that really embrace the creativity of learning, the Nando's menu allowed for this. By providing easy, middle and hard readings that could be easily printed off and posted home for students, this allowed them to easily access the work if they had limited technology. There was no need for them to sign in to Seneca Learning, no requirement to complete anything on bite size. In terms of our improvements, within 4 or 5 weeks it became clear that some students were becoming fatigued and perhaps a little bit bored with this style of working, so we knew we needed to change things up. And again, those tricky concepts at Key Stage 4 and 5 were proving a challenge to some of our less academic students. It became clear that expecting them to do the reading and then just get on with a task wasn't enough. We needed to intervene and we needed to do something more. So we got to thinking, how are we going to teach these challenging concepts, and how are we going to reinvigorate after a few weeks of working like this? So in the weeks leading up to half term, we had an opportunity to consider our successes and areas for development and work out what we were going to do to improve our remote offering. For Key Stage 3, we refreshed all of the Nando's tasks, so they were all completely new for Year 7 to 9. For Year 9, we decided that the second part of the summer term would focus on GCSE preparation work, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. We also began recording PowerPoints that had embedded tasks, and again I'll expand on that more in a minute. For Key Stage 4 and 5, we started having Teams calls, lasting around 30 minutes. These allowed us both to present new information as well as talking over work that they've done independently and clearing up any misconceptions. We also put in directed exam questions. It became clear that some pupils didn't feel comfortable forming their own extended answer questions and then writing them, not at this stage. So we decided to provide them with some directed questions that they could answer instead. We also started recording PowerPoints and embedding these within the offer for Key Stage 4 and 5. For our Year 9 students, we decided we would use the 7 weeks this side of half term as preparation for GCSE. There would be no GCSE content taught at this stage. Now this is because we feel that there is a great deal of beauty in the debate and face-to-face activities that can occur at GCSE. Furthermore, some of the more groundwork style lessons for the GCSE, such as the creation stories and the nature and attributes of God, might be a little bit dry to do independently. They really come to life when we can debate them. So therefore it made sense for us to keep the GCSE content for September. We also felt that it would be unfair on those that either can't or aren't engaging to start the GCSE when they could be left behind. We can cover half of Paper 1, Christianity, in 7 weeks, and so it would really put those with limited access to technology or those who aren't in the right place mentally to engage at a huge disadvantage if we made a start on the GCSE content. So as a department we got to thinking, what would we like students to know before they start the GCSE? What common misconceptions do they come into Key Stage 4 with that perhaps we haven't had the opportunity to address at Key Stage 3? What assumptions of knowledge do we make at Key Stage 4 and then find that actually, when it comes to it, the assumptions provide problems in Year 10? I'm sure I'm not the only RS teacher who's had to explain many times that Catholics are Christians and not another religion. So, we thought we would focus for the first few weeks on humanism. We would look at core ideas, values, approaches to war, and approaches to God. Now, for those of you who teach the OCR GCSE, you'll know that humanism doesn't really appear that much. It appears a little bit in the third paper, in the unit about dialogue between religious and non-religious beliefs. However, humanism is a growing movement. It does provide a challenge to religion, and besides which, we don't just want to teach to the exam. It's really quite interesting, so we thought this would be a fantastic opportunity for students to learn about something that they wouldn't normally have the opportunity to do. We also decided to put in a close case study of a conflict, and we focused on the Northern Irish Troubles. Now the reason for this is some of our students come with certain misconceptions and preconceptions about different religions, and we wanted to highlight that Christianity has had its divisions and has had its conflicts. And lastly, our last 2 weeks focused on the development of Christianity in Britain, and we borrowed from the history curriculum to cover in a little bit more depth the events of the Reformation under Henry VIII and throughout the Tudor dynasty. This is because many of our students do get confused between the Church of England and Catholicism, and actually having this opportunity to contextualise Christianity would be really valuable. Fairly early on in the period of remote working, I'd started to record PowerPoints for my Key Stage 5 class. It became clear within a few weeks that some of them just weren't in the right sort of place to be able to do some reading and answer some questions. They needed the content explained. We then started rolling out our recorded PowerPoints to Key Stage 4, and presently we're embedding them in Key Stage 3 as well. Now, I love these recorded PowerPoints because they allow us to actually explain the content. For instance, the first one I did for Year 8 allowed me to talk through Guru Nanak's religious experiences, rather than just expecting the pupils to do some reading and to just understand it. They also allow us to embed tasks such as brainstorming and thinking time. For Key Stage 4 and 5, I'm using them to talk through model answers and model paragraphs as well, so they get that all-important exam-based skills that they might miss out on otherwise. At the end of each recorded PowerPoint, there is a differentiated task, and that is what we ask the pupils to send to us for assessment. Now, I was a little bit concerned about asking my colleagues to re-record these PowerPoints. However, they've actually provided us with limited additional workload. For Years 7, 8, 10 and 12, we've simply adapted lessons on our shared drive that were already prepared. So we've removed any reference to group work or debate, and we've changed them to brainstorming and thinking activities. For Year 9, with the new curriculum, we have created new lessons from scratch. However, I'm sure that if they go well in this period of lockdown, next year we'll look at introducing some introduction to GCSE lessons and perhaps over a couple of weeks in lesson time covering them. So I don't think that there will be just a one-off. I'd like to share with you now some examples. So these are taken from the Year 9 work on humanism. So here, I would simply ask the students to note down what they can remember from last week. It is that simple, a simple starter that normally I would do on mini whiteboards in a class setting, but instead I'm talking over the PowerPoint and asking them just to note it down, just to get themselves thinking again. I would then spend a little bit of time talking through the content, and then I would allow them to apply it. So, this comes from a lesson on humanism and on humanist values, focusing on what humanists value about the self, relationships, society and environment. I ask pupils to prioritise these in order of importance and to note down why they are putting them in this priority. I then ask them which overlap with religious views. Can they think of any clear examples? And I offer them the opportunity to use a Venn diagram if it suits them. I then give them a challenging question to think about. So what happens if these values contradict each other? And give them a couple of examples. Now, in a regular classroom setting, the prioritisation task would be done individually. We'd then have some feedback, have some questioning, and then possibly a debate. So this has been adapted to working remotely. Now, in a regular classroom setting, towards the end of the lesson, I would do some sort of evaluation which would lead to a discussion or a debate. Obviously, in a remote setting, this isn't going to be possible. So what I do instead is ask the students to think about and maybe discuss with a family member a number of evaluation questions. And I make sure that these evaluation questions are directly relevant to a written task. It's an expectation for the Key Stage 3 PowerPoints that at the end of each there is a choice of written task. There is an extra level of differentiation. So here is the choice of task at the end of the humanism lesson. The red, slightly more straightforward, amber, more challenging, green, even more challenging. Now in this example, each question is an evaluation GCSE style question. Now that might not always be the case. The red might be to do a timeline, the amber might be to do some explanation, and the green might be to do some evaluation. It really depends what I want out of the lesson. I make sure, however, that for each of the questions I give clear success criteria and clear instructions as to what I would like the students to do. So in this case, I've given them the structure of an evaluation question with hints that at GCSE they'll need to do 3 peel points for both sides. Now I also teach politics at A-level, and at the moment I'm teaching the political philosophy paper. And I'd like to share some examples with you of how I've adapted remote learning and recorded PowerPoints for Key Stage 5. So here we have an introduction slide where I've explained to the students that they need to know the key ideas of liberalism. I asked them to recap that, and I also explained to them that they need to know the different scholarly views. Now I've sorted the scholars into classical and modern liberals. Now the students have had a few minutes to consider the key ideas of liberalism, and so then I present to them what they should have had. I then ask them to draw a mind map to show how they interact with each other. I give them a few minutes to do that, I pause the recording, and then I talk them through how I've done it, making it very clear that there are different ways that they can all interact with each other. So for instance here, I've linked equality and pluralism, because pluralism is acceptance of many different views, and that therefore requires equality. Now for my Year 12 pupils, I don't just want to give them and talk through the content, I want them to actually go and do some research themselves, as well as being able to explain the core concepts. So I give them the Tutor to You link and direct them to the page in the textbook that they need to read. Now in the case of this lesson, I want them to read about John Locke, and I want them to make notes and link them to the core ideas of liberalism, which I've given to them in the yellow box. I pause the PowerPoint for a few minutes, or maybe go on to the next slide so they can pause the PowerPoint and stop me from wittering on for a bit, and then I talk about all of John Locke's ideas, and I have colour-coded them to show how they link to the core values of liberalism. I then need them to apply what they've learned and what they've read, and this is what I ask them to submit each week. So in the case of this lesson, I've given them an essay plan to do. This is a past paper question. To what extent do classical and modern liberals agree over equality? Now, I may or may not, depending on the lesson, then give them a model plan. In the case of this lesson, because it comes at an end of a piece of work at a point that makes sense, I've not given them a model plan. I want to see what they can come up with. However, I have given them a model paragraph because I want them to remember how to structure their paragraph and not just spend 7 or 8 weeks taking notes. So what I've done is I've written a model paragraph, and then I will talk through the different parts of this paragraph because there are key assessment objectives that they need to hit in each paragraph in order to get the highest marks. It would be really easy to just leave it at that and think that our students have got all they need to crack on with the recorded PowerPoints, with the Nando's menu, with the reading, with textbooks, with guided questions. However, I really miss my students. I miss talking to them. I miss the bread and butter of my day job. So I like to follow up. So I've been doing weekly Teams calls to clarify and answer questions. Now plenty of my colleagues are using Teams, and we're all using it in a slightly different way. I know some of my colleagues are having their Teams calls about the work on the day that it is set. However, I was a little bit concerned that because I'm doing these recorded PowerPoints, if I did that, I'd just end up telling them the same thing as the recorded PowerPoints. So I'm approaching this from a flipped learning perspective. I set the work, the week that it's due in, so the week after, I then have the Teams calls that I go over any tricky concepts and I clarify or I answer questions. In terms of feedback from students over the last few weeks since we've started rolling out these audio PowerPoints, we've had some really positive feedback. These are from our Year 8 students, commenting that one of them thinks it's the closest to a real lesson, maybe even more than a Teams meeting. And I think that speaks volumes because yes, we managed to build in thinking time and brainstorming. We don't get our debates. How could we? We're all working differently. But they have an opportunity to explore and consider different views. One other student said that they liked the type of lesson and they thought it was very helpful. And that gave us a great boost of confidence. So where do we go from here in the next few weeks? For Key Stage 3, we want to start having Teams calls for our incoming GCSE students. We surveyed our Year 9s and asked them, those that are doing the GCSE, whether they'd find this helpful, and a few responded in the affirmative. So we're going to use these as an opportunity to introduce the specification, talk about different questions and maybe start talking about the different type of keywords and GCSE language that they're going to be coming across very, very soon. We're also going to be embedding our recorded PowerPoints across Year 7 to 9. So all of them, as well as the Nando's menu, have the opportunity to have different tasks and content explained to them. For Key Stage 4 and 5, with them coming back into school, albeit in a very different way to normal, we need to coordinate our Teams calls and our remote teaching with the face-to-face teaching that they're going to have. Now, when there are 2 RS teachers delivering the A-level, this is going to be no mean feat. We've got to make sure we're being fair to our students. So therefore, we don't set them too much work, and for those students that are unable to come into school, they are not put at a disadvantage. As well as that, across the RS department, we have a number of staff who are working from home. So therefore, we have to reconcile the face-to-face teaching with those that are still working from home. This may mean them calling in via Teams and doing face-to-face remotely while a colleague is in the classroom being the scribe or doing the classroom management. Certainly, even 6 months ago, I'd never even considered this as a way of working, and now in a few weeks' time, this is what I'm going to be planning to do. So what have we learned over the course of this process? Well, firstly, we have a new appreciation of the importance of differentiation by task and by resource. I think when you've been teaching for a few years, it's very easy to get a bit comfortable with differentiation, maybe to get a little bit lazy. However, it's not good enough while we're teaching remotely to just rely on differentiation by outcome, or maybe just a differentiated set of questions. We have to have different tasks and different resources to allow our students to access the work. We've also learnt how important it is to give a choice of task and to encourage students to embrace harder options each week and not to be happy with just getting work done for the sake of it. We've learnt how important it is to quickly feed back to our students and to be supportive. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. We don't know what sort of support they're getting from their parents, or if their parents even look at what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Even though it's not in our mark policy, I make sure that I give feedback to every piece of work that I receive. Because for that pupil, just knowing that an adult has looked over their work and cares and spends just a few minutes giving them some feedback can make all the difference. We've also learnt how important it is for us to actually be there to explain concepts. Certainly when I was doing my teacher training 9 years ago, it was very clear and it was trendy at the time that the teacher was there as a facilitator. And actually, a lot of my job was trying to not explain things. I was trying to get pupils to work it out for themselves. Well, actually, when it comes to learning remotely, I can't just assume that by giving my students a piece of paper and some tasks, they'll get it. I need to be able to explain the concepts to them. We've all massively improved our technical and ICT skills. Until lockdown, I had no idea what Teams was, and until maybe a month ago, I didn't even know that you could record over a PowerPoint. And these are 2 skills that I use on a daily basis now. And lastly, one thing that has really come to light since this lockdown is how lovely it is to talk to students and how lucky we are to have this job. Before Teams, I felt really sad that the only interaction I had with students was over email, but actually my Teams calls are amongst the highlights of my week because I get to have a chat with them, have a catch up, see how they're going, and actually understand how well that they are doing with the work, and it truly has been joyful. So thanks very much for listening. If you've got any questions or any comments, please do feel free to get in touch. I wish you all the best for the rest of this lockdown strange working period and all the best for the summer holiday.